We're beginning Chapter 2 of Surprise Kill Vanish, The Secret History of CIA Paramilitary Armies, Operators, and Assassins by Annie Jacobson. Tertia Optio. 6 months passed. On the night of April 1946, America's ambassador to the Soviet Union, General Walter Beetle Smith, was riding in his chauffeur-driven limousine headed to the Kremlin, where he was set to meet with Joseph Stalin. Tempered yet tenacious, the former general was a man well-versed in military operations. During the war, Beetle Smith served as Eisenhower's chief of staff. Wartime colleagues called him Ike's Hatchet Man. General Eisenhower called him the greatest general manager of war. An all-around intimidating figure, Beetle Smith was rarely one to express unease. And yet, here he was, feeling apprehensive about what lay ahead. He served as President Truman's top diplomat now, and the issue at hand was how not to go to war with the Soviet Union. I believed myself more or less immune to excitement, but I must confess, I experienced a feeling of tension as the hour for the interview approached, Beetle Smith later recalled. I thought the meeting might be a stormy one. World War II had been over for less than a year, and already Stalin was the new nemesis of the Western world. Stalin was paranoid and power mad. As premier of the Soviet Union, he ruled by terror. Since his rise to power in the early 1920s, he'd starved and killed 1 million of his own people, and personally oversaw the assassination of rivals who threatened him, including Leon Trotsky, an early architect of the Soviet state, whom he had ordered to be killed in Coyoacan, Mexico in 1940. Stalin assassinated writers and philosophers, unwilling to peddle propaganda, and scientists and engineers who failed to solve his technology problems. In 1937, he had 8 of his top army generals executed in the Great Purge. During World War II, he had been one of America's most powerful allies, which made it necessary to look beyond his crimes and win the war. Now, from the perspective of the State Department officials to whom Walter Beetle Smith reported, Joseph Stalin was no longer behaving as a friend. The U.S. Embassy car moved quickly down Otterbat Street through the soot-stained snow. The American flags attached to its antenna, whipping in the night air. This route to the Kremlin was along one of the most heavily policed streets in the world. But because the car's occupants enjoyed diplomatic privileges, it never had to stop. All the traffic lights remained green as Beetle Smith's driver hurtled along. Sitting alone in the back seat, the ambassador read and reread pages of notes prepared for him by the State Department, possibly points to be stressed in conversation with Stalin. Its header read, just a few days prior, Beetle Smith's charge d'affaires at the embassy in Moscow, a career diplomat named George Kennan, had advised President Truman on the threat posed by Stalin in what would become known as the Long Telegram. Stalin knew only the logic of force, Kennan said. The Soviets were on the move, devouring territory around the globe. The United States had only one option. Stalin had to be stopped. Beetle Smith's mission was to find out how much more land Stalin intended to grab, to look at a map made the problem self-evident. Russia's human losses in World War II had been colossal, with some 20 million dead. But more troubling for the West were its territorial gains. During the war, Stalin's Red Army took possession of almost half of Europe, then kept much of it after the Nazis capitulated. In 1946, power came in numbers. Military strength was still about a nation's potential army size. The US population was around 140 million. Stalin ruled over 200 million Russians and another 100 million people living beyond the country's traditional borders, in the land that had been grabbed. To make matters even more threatening, the Union of Soviet Socialist Republic, USSR, was getting bigger by the season. The question Beetle Smith answered was simple, but uncomfortable. How much further was Stalin going to go? The embassy car deposited Beetle Smith at the Kremlin's main gate, and the ambassador was taken inside to Stalin's personal office building. Beetle Smith was escorted up to the third floor, down a long, austere corridor, and into a high-ceilinged, wood-paneled conference room. There sat Stalin, his back to the wall, facing Beetle Smith as he entered. Behind the dictator hung massive oil portraits depicting the great Russian marshals, most of them on horseback. Beetle Smith spotted Servov and Kutsov, two military strategists known for their expansionist views. Once seated, Beetle Smith spoke first, through an interpreter. He discussed the most pressing issues from the State Department's notes. Watching Stalin as he took exaggerated draws on a long, thin cigarette. By the time Beetle Smith finished talking, Stalin had picked up a red pencil and begun writing. Points to later debate, Beetle Smith first assumed. But upon closer inspection, it was clear that Joseph Stalin was doodling. The ambassador was stunned. His drawings, repeated many times, looked to me like lopsided hearts done in red with a small question mark in the middle. Stalin entered the conversation by making a point about oil, Iranian oil. "You don't understand our situation with regards to oil and Iran," Stalin said, suggesting that he could answer the ambassador's questions with a singularly cryptic point. "The Baku oil fields are our major source of supply. We're not going to risk our oil supply. The Soviet Union needed a greater share in the exploration of the world's oil," Stalin said, and the competition for these resources was a significant point of contention between Russia and the United States. As Beetle Smith considered his response, Stalin took the opportunity to bring up a more personal matter. Lately, Great Britain and the United States had been teaming up against Russia and placing obstacles in her path, Stalin said. Beetle Smith was caught off guard. Did Stalin really believe that the United States and Great Britain are united in an alliance to thwart Russia, he asked. "Duh," Stalin replied in a long, slow breath. "Yes. I must affirm in the strongest possible terms that it is not the case," the ambassador insisted, except it was true. British Prime Minister Churchill had stated as much just 1 month before, during a speech at Westminster College in Fulton, Missouri. "An iron curtain had descended across the European continent," Churchill famously declared. "From Warsaw to Berlin, all these famous cities and populations around them lie in what I must call the Soviet sphere, and all are subject in one form or another only to Soviet influence. but to a very high and in many cases increasing measure of control from Moscow. Churchill had compared Stalin to a puppet master. This infuriated Stalin. Like most tyrants, he resented any person who suggested that his popularity was based not on adoration, but fear. Coward! Dogs are out here. Stalin had hated Churchill for decades. In 1919, Churchill tried to instigate war against Russia, and persuaded the United States to join him in an armed occupation against parts of our territory. Stalin reminded Ambassador Beadle Smith, adding, "Lately, he's been at it again." Stalin called the Westminster speech an unfriendly act and said it was an unwarranted act upon the USSR. He pointed out that the United States would never stand by passively if such an insult was hurled in its direction. But Russia, as the events of the past few years have proved, is not stupid, Stalin forewarned. We can recognize our friends from our potential enemies. Ambassador Beadle Smith was in a bind. He needed an answer. For President Truman, so he needed an answer for President Truman, so he asked Stalin directly, "How far is Russia going to go?" Stalin paused, stopped doodling the red hearts and the question marks. Looking directly at Walter Beadle Smith, he replied in a monotone, "We're not going to go much further." But what exactly did much further mean? That was the enigma of 1946. Stalin ended the interview, and the ambassador was shown the door. 11 months later, the United States drew a line in the sand, declaring communism the enemy of democracy. On March 12, 1947, in a dramatic speech to a joint session of Congress, President Truman warned the American people that Moscow had to be stopped. It must be the policy of the United States to support free peoples who are resisting attempted subjugation, Truman said. Without American help, darkness and cataclysm would descend in the world, and disorder might well spread throughout the Middle East. In a display of near unanimous support, the members of Congress took to their feet. 2 minutes President Truman enjoyed his first standing ovation since the end of the war. The speech marked the beginning of the Truman Doctrine, American foreign policy designed to confront and counter Soviet geopolitical expansion. Congress passed the National Security Act of 1947, resurrecting the U.S. military and intelligence agencies and creating a national security apparatus for the modern era. The act officially established the Central Intelligence Agency and the White House National Security Council, NSC, and it gave way to an unconventional warfare division for the president to command on his authority and his alone. This unit was designed to be covert. George Kennan called it a guerrilla warfare corps for the commander-in-chief. Covert action would become the president's hidden hand, visible only to those in his inner circle. Teneo. The National Security Council directed the CIA to take control of these hidden hand operations. Officially called covert action operations under Title 50, authority of the U.S. Code, the Department of Defense, would work under a separate authority called Title 10, which outlines the role of the armed forces. The distinction remains in effect today. During a National Security Council meeting in December of 1947, the President's advisors clarified that the CIA's Covert Action Authority would include preventative direct action through paramilitary activities as a means of countering the vicious covert activities of the USSR. Direct action would become a key phrase at the CIA, one that allowed its officers and operators Title 50 authority, not available to anyone else in the United States unless expressly directed by the President. The CIA's General Counsel, Lawrence Houston, requested clarification. How much autonomy would the CIA have in conducting these covert action operations? Lack of such specific direction may be considered a weakness in the National Security Act of 1947 that deserves further consideration by Congress, Houston wrote. The following month, National Security Council Directive 10/2, National Security Council 10-2, provided the clarification Houston had sought. A new office was to be created inside the CIA, called the Office of Special Projects, where covert actions would be planned and executed in peacetime. In times of war, the CIA was to coordinate its covert operations with the Defense Department and the Joint Chiefs of Staff. Covert operations are understood to be all activities which are conducted or sponsored by this government against hostile foreign states or groups, according to the directive, but which are so planned and executed that if uncovered, the U.S. government can plausibly disclaim any responsibility for them. While the concept of willful ignorance has insulated countless commanders and kings from embarrassment and scandal, it was in this moment that the President's National Security Council made the concept of plausible deniability an official construct. Plausible deniability would hereafter allow U.S. presidents to say they didn't know. For the first time in American history, the President had at his disposal a secret paramilitary organization authorized by Congress to carry out hidden hand operations to protect U.S. national security interests around the world. Before NSC 10-2, there were two ways in which U.S. foreign policy and national security were pursued. The first option was diplomacy. The second, war. Covert action was now the President's third option, or tertia optio, after diplomacy failed and Title X military operations was deemed unwise. On September 1st, 1948, the Office of Special Projects changed its name to a more innocuous-sounding Office of Policy Coordination, OPC, and got to work. The new organization's activities might well enhance possibilities for achieving American objectives by means short of war, said George Kennan, co-architect of National Security Council, or NSC 10-2, along with James Forrestal, the nation's first Secretary of Defense, according to a report written by the National Security Council, kept classified for 55 years. The CIA's Office of Policy Coordination would now be responsible for covert action paramilitary operations, including guerrilla movements, underground armies, sabotage, and assassination. In the first 2 years of existence, the CIA's covert operations concentrated on anti-communist partisan groups in Europe and the Eastern Bloc. Then, on June 25th, 1950, the unthinkable happened. The Army of North Korea, backed by the Soviet tanks and Chinese intelligence, invaded South Korea with the goal of reuniting the divided country under communist rule. The entire Western world was caught off guard. The CIA had failed to foresee an attack that the U.S. national security apparatus feared could be the opening salvo of World War III. The United Nations called upon the invading communist troops to cease fighting and withdraw to the 38th parallel. When the invaders refused, the UN Security Council looked to its members for help. I have ordered the United States Air and Sea Forces to give the Korean government troops cover and support, President Truman announced from the White House press room. Just after 5 years of peace, the country was at war again. Behind the lines, paramilitary operations were needed to augment conventional forces. The CIA surged ahead with plans to take the lead. A little bit of shorter chapter today.